Noam Chomsky's Towards a New Cold War is a seminal work that offers a critical analysis of American foreign policy from the end of World War II through the late 1970s. The book is a collection of essays and articles written by Chomsky during the 1960s and 1970s, a period marked by the intensification of the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and the rise of American interventionism in various parts of the world. Chomsky's central thesis is that American foreign policy, often presented as a defense of democracy and freedom, is in reality driven by a combination of economic interests and a desire for global dominance. The book is a scathing critique of the bipartisan consensus in Washington, which Chomsky argues consistently prioritizes corporate and elite interests over the principles of democracy and human rights. Chomsky begins by examining the roots of American foreign policy, tracing its origins to the early days of the Cold War. He argues that America has always sought to maintain its global hegemony, often through the use of military force and covert operations. Chomsky is particularly critical of the Truman Doctrine, which he sees as a declaration of a global crusade against communism that justified American intervention in the internal affairs of other nations. According to Chomsky, this policy set the stage for decades of American aggression and interventionism, from the Korean War to the Bay of Pigs invasion to the Vietnam War. Chomsky's analysis is deeply informed by his understanding of the relationship between power and ideology. He argues that American policymakers have consistently used the rhetoric of freedom and democracy to justify actions that are, in reality, motivated by economic and strategic interests. This is particularly evident in Chomsky's discussion of American interventions in Latin America, where he argues that America has consistently supported authoritarian regimes that are willing to align with America's interests, even at the expense of their own people's democratic aspirations. Chomsky's critique is not limited to the actions of the U.S. government. He also takes aim at the mainstream media and intellectuals, whom he accuses of serving as apologists for U.S. imperialism. One of the key themes of Towards a New Cold War is the continuity of American foreign policy across different administrations. Chomsky argues that there is a deep-seated consensus among the American political and economic elite that transcends party lines. This consensus is rooted in a commitment to maintaining American global dominance and protecting the interests of American corporations. Chomsky is particularly critical of the Democratic Party, which he argues has often pursued policies that are just as aggressive and imperialistic as those of the Republicans. He points to the Kennedy and Johnson administrations' escalation of the Vietnam War as evidence of this bipartisan commitment to American imperialism. Chomsky's critique of American foreign policy is also informed by his analysis of the global economic system. He argues that American interventionism is often driven by the need to protect and expand the global capitalist system, which is dominated by American corporations. This is particularly evident in Chomsky's discussion of American policy in the Middle East, where he argues that America has consistently supported authoritarian regimes that are willing to protect American access to oil and other resources. Chomsky also discusses the role of international institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which he argues are tools of American economic dominance throughout towards a new Cold War. Chomsky emphasizes the importance of understanding the historical context of American foreign policy. He argues that American actions cannot be understood in isolation, but must be seen as part of a broader pattern of imperialism and interventionism that dates back to the early days of the Republic. Chomsky is particularly critical of what he sees as the selective amnesia of American policymakers and intellectuals, who often ignore or downplay the darker aspects of American history. He argues that this selective memory allows the US to present itself as a benign force for good in the world, even as it continues to engage in aggressive and often violent actions. Chomsky is also deeply critical of the American media, which he argues plays a crucial role in perpetuating the myths of American benevolence and exceptionalism. He argues that the media often serves as a propaganda tool for the American government, uncritically repeating official narratives and marginalizing dissenting voices. Chomsky is particularly critical of the way the media covered the Vietnam War, arguing that it largely failed to challenge the government's justification for the war and instead focused on the question of how to win, rather than whether the war was just. He also discusses the role of intellectuals in shaping public opinion, arguing that many prominent academics and commentators have been complicit in justifying American aggression and imperialism. One of the most striking aspects of Towards a New Cold War is Chomsky's analysis of the Vietnam War. He argues that the war was not a tragic mistake, as it is often portrayed, but rather a logical consequence of American imperialism. Chomsky is particularly critical of the way the war has been remembered and commemorated in America, arguing that the focus on the suffering of American soldiers and the question of whether the war was winnable serves to obscure the larger issue of American aggression and the suffering of the Vietnamese people. He also discusses the long-term consequences of the war, arguing that it has left a lasting legacy of militarism and interventionism in American foreign policy. Chomsky's critique of American foreign policy is not limited to the actions of the American government. He also takes aim at the broader structures of power and domination that underpin the global order. He argues that America is the dominant force in a global system of capitalism and imperialism that exploits the resources and labor of the global South for the benefit of the global North. Chomsky is particularly critical of the role of multinational corporations, which he argues are the real beneficiaries of American foreign policy. He discusses the ways in which these corporations have shaped American policy to serve their interests, often at the expense of democracy and human rights. In Towards a New Cold War, Chomsky also discusses the rise of the military-industrial complex, which he argues has become a powerful force in American politics and foreign policy. He argues that the close relationship between the American government and the defense industry has led to a situation where war and militarism are seen as inevitable and even desirable. Chomsky is particularly critical of the way this relationship has shaped American policy in the Middle East, where he argues that America has consistently pursued policies that served the interests of the defense industry and its allies in the region. Chomsky's analysis of U.S. foreign policy is not only critical, but also deeply moral. He argues that the U.S. has a responsibility to live up to the principles of democracy and human rights that it claims to uphold. He is particularly critical of the way the U.S. has often used the rhetoric of human rights to justify actions that are, in reality, motivated by economic and strategic interests. Chomsky argues that true respect for human rights requires a fundamental rethinking of U.S. foreign policy, one that prioritizes the needs and aspirations of people around the world over the interests of corporations and the military-industrial complex. Towards the end of the book, Chomsky discusses the prospects for change in U.S. foreign policy. He is cautiously optimistic, arguing that the growing awareness of the contradictions and injustices of U.S. policy could lead to a shift in public opinion and eventually in policy. However, he is also realistic about the obstacles to change, particularly the entrenched power of the military-industrial complex and the corporate elite. Chomsky calls for a broad-based movement for peace and justice that can challenge the structures of power and domination that underpin U.S. foreign policy.